Hi everyone. So it's 11:05. We're just let the rest of the participants stream in, but thank you all for being on time and joining us today um, with Software Stats in a conversation with Lao San. Um, we have today JN, SR, and Sherry from Lao San, and I'll introduce myself first. I am your co-facilitator today alongside Godwin, and my name is Marcus. I have short hair, short black hair. I'm wearing a pair of glasses and earrings. I'm of Chinese descent and I go by he, him pronouns. And I have with me Godwin, who would introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, I'm Godwin. I use they them pronouns and my camera is not turned on. I'm an art worker based in Singapore and a co-organizer at Software Stats. So I help plan and run projects and also help with maintenance of our collective space.
Thank you. So maybe just some technical aspects about the meeting before we begin. This event is being recorded and the documentation would be disseminated for public viewing later. So if you might have any concerns, you might want to contact the host or turn off your cameras. On the bottom panel of your Zoom window, you can see English to Chinese, Cantonese simultaneous interpretation. Please feel free to switch them on if needed. And I would also like to thank our interpreters, HY, CLS, and Roxy today for their assistance in making this meeting more accessible. Everyone in this meeting is encouraged to co-learn and challenge one another during this session. However, we would encourage everyone to be aware of the spaces you're taking up or not taking up within this discussion. At Software Stats, we also do not tolerate harassment, harmful or dehumanizing behavior or expression, including and not limited to racism, gender discrimination, classism, ableism, and xenophobia. And if such behavior persists, moderators might have to remove the relevant parties. So today, Software Stats is very excited to have different members of the Lausan Collective together with us. And before I let them introduce themselves, I would like to maybe provide some context for the talk. So over the past year and more, Hong Kong has seen a slew of political twists and turns, beginning with the Anti-Extradition Law Amendment Bill protests, or anti-ELAP in short, in the summer of 2019. The protests have evolved into a leaderless uprising calling for greater political autonomy, calling out police brutality, and a host of other issues. And these protests are also simultaneously situated within larger geopolitical events in the world, including the US-China trade war, COVID-19, alongside other movements such as Black Lives Matter, protests in Lebanon, Puerto Rico, and more recently, Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand. On top of articulating the complexities of the Hong Kong movement, particularly through intersectional frames of gender, class, race, and citizenship, Lausan Collective has also sought to situate Hong Kong or the Hong Kong movement within a geopolitics that's beyond imperial alignment. So without further ado, I'll hand the time over to Lausan Collective to introduce themselves and their work.
Okay, I guess I can go first. Hi, everyone. First of all, thanks so much to Marcus, Godwin, and everyone at Software Studs for inviting us and for all the really careful coordinating work that they've done. Thanks also to our interpreters for doing this really critical accessibility and translation work. We're really glad to be here. So this is Jan. I'm a researcher, organizer, and writer with Lausan Collective.
Hey everyone, thanks for the introduction. I'm SR. I go by she, her pronouns. I'm an editor and a translator and an organizer with Lausan Collective.
Hi, I'm Cherry. I'm a part of Lausan, and I'm a freelance art worker that usually do visual design related stuff and organize sometimes within Lausan.
Okay, thanks for the introductions. So maybe the first question would be, could you maybe elaborate on Lausan's emergence, the context for Lausan's emergence, and perhaps elaborating on how Lausan organizes themselves?
Yeah, I'm gonna go for this one. So Lausan was something that had emerged out of the 2019 anti-establishment protest in Hong Kong, of course, from last summer, and we're still going on now. And how we started was sort of really organically through just finding like-minded people online on Twitter and from prior sort of collaborative projects. And then we had identified a need for a more sort of radical sort of position of critique coming from the Hong Kong movement. And so in late July, I think around the time that I think police had sort of turned a blind eye on thugs and like triads attacking civilians and attacking journalists and also protesters in Tuen Mun, was when we sort of came together as a WhatsApp group. And then we later on planned to do a whole publication and also to sort of establish like a centralized place to gather all of these different organizing efforts and to amplify existing leftist perspectives in Hong Kong and also to produce original writing and research. So that's sort of the rough condition of emergence for us. And at the time we were dealing with a lot of sort of different intertwining challenges coming from the history of social movement in Hong Kong. And I think that primarily we're trying to answer this question at the time, which was, what does it mean to take Hong Kong as a position of critique? And so we were wondering about if it would be possible to use Hong Kong as a vantage point between multiple colonial regimes, multiple empires, and also sort of this contemporary condition of colliding nationalisms to sort of turn our attention toward an anti-capitalist critique. And so I think like something that we're still grappling with right now is, what does a decolonial left politics mean? And so why do we say decolonial left politics rather than sort of saying post-colonial or sort of just any type of other decolonization efforts, right? So this is something that we're still grappling with in terms of what decolonial left means in relation to self-determination, in relation to the idea of independence, to the idea of sort of like different imaginations of what liberation means for Hong Kong. And so this is something that is, I think, particularly challenging to address in light of sort of the aftermath of the umbrella movement and sort of what is widely sort of considered the failure of 2014. And so a lot of people are sort of blaming it on at the time what is seen as like the failure of mainstream Democrats, and how it has like sort of given rise to different localist and nativist sentiments on the ground in Hong Kong. And so this rise of localism has obviously been sort of the main motivator of certain really virulent anti-mainland Chinese sentiments and actions in Hong Kong that dovetailed later on with the coronavirus response in Hong Kong, and sort of just like really directed attention to how the movement has experienced a right-wing turn. So this is one of the really big things that we're trying to push against, and push against like with this sort of decolonial left perspective. And so I think that this is also something that we're trying to situate within a larger framework of just this longer duration of really polarized identity politics in Hong Kong, sort of this imagination of what it means to be a Hong Konger and what it means to take on the identity of Hong Konger. which now I feel like from the time Lausanne was established last summer has increasingly been divisive, increasingly been imagined in really extreme and different ways. And one of the things that we noticed, and one of the reasons why we do all of this anti-capitalist and sort of class and gender and race-oriented critique is that we think that sort of this Hong Kong identity is being taken in ways that are distinctly middle class, distinctly bourgeois, distinctly Han Chinese, and distinctly and very unfortunately exclusionary. And so this is something that we're constantly trying to understand, which is how do we make sense of the Hong Kong movement as something that doesn't necessarily have to be xenophobic, doesn't necessarily have to be exclusionary or Han-centric, or sort of just focused on a certain class of protesters, right? And so having those two questions in the background has made our work in fleshing out what decolonization, what decolonial left means in Hong Kong, especially challenging. I think a positive turn from our emergence out of that moment in late July when police violence was reaching a boiling point was that I think that we had come into the conversation at a moment when the conversation around abolition, police abolition, prison abolition has sort of first emerged in Hong Kong. And so I think that this is something that we are very like, yeah, we're sort of still trying to figure out how we can advance this discourse in a more sort of participatory way in Hong Kong, but also trying to link it back toward international and existing sort of organizing efforts in the US and in anywhere around the abolition of police. And so sort of, yeah, so these are sort of three broad questions that had really constituted the context of why we needed to form Lausanne and really continues to inform our work today. Yeah, sorry, that's a really long answer.
Yeah, no worries. So maybe just riffing off on the idea of the complexities of Hong Kong's political landscape, we have, in the terminology that has developed, protest terminology that's developed over the past year, the yellow ribbon camp and the blue ribbon camp. You have pro-establishment and and pro-democracy camp. You also have left-wing and right-wing. So how does Lausanne actually fit into the city's sort of complex political landscape, maybe for audiences that are less familiar with the kinds of factions or political spectrum that has emerged in Hong Kong over the last year?
I guess I can start on this one. It kind of dovetails with what the previous answer ended on, which was talking about police abolition. And just to jump really quickly back to the decolonial aspect, I think it is very nascent. It's not something that I don't think we're trying to identify as like a major part of last year's movement, but I think we're coming at it from a very kind of like hopeful angle, right? Whereas the targets of Hong Kong resistance has long been the CCP and the lack of self-determination. I think what was so inspiring about last year was like millions of people have now really identified the structures of domination in their lives, for the first time, like police, for example, but then also kind of deepening the critique of other things that have long faced anger and resentment from the people, like land oligarchy, the structurally rigged legislature, tycoons, and so on. So, I think there's a class and economic critique in there that needs to be nurtured. I think the important thing for me is to really keep going with this analysis of colonial capitalist structures, that were built and left by the British and then picked up wholesale by the CCP after the handover, in order to really kind of deepen the resistance to what is sometimes, I think, narrowly considered solely a fight between like freedom and authoritarianism. I think it's really difficult work to do without being called left plastic, jiaogao, that a minority left in Hong Kong has long done. We're just trying to like boost their voices and help with political education and organizing labor. So I don't know if that helps to kind of open the conversation about where we fit in amongst the political landscape in Hong Kong. But I think, definitely want to emphasize that we're trying to identify certain elements that we want to nurture, but then also, leftist work has gone on for many decades there, and we're not like reinventing the wheel or anything.
Yeah, I think that's really important to emphasize. I think a common misunderstanding about Lausanne's work is that we're introducing this brand new perspective into the Hong Kong political scene, which is just blatantly false, because the Hong Kong left political tradition has been something that was that has always been there. It may be in plain sight because it doesn't have the most straightforward relationship with perhaps mainstream movements or mainstream media, but nevertheless, like, it's been a part of all sorts of different sort of organizing efforts for decades and decades. And so this is something that I think is complicated and sort of inherent to our contribution, which is sort of not really to invent or to come up with anything that is really unheard of, but to actually expand on and amplify existing perspectives on the ground. And so this is complicated because I think still nowadays, like in Hong Kong, the notion left, or even just like the label left, is such a political misnomer, because I think like the Hong Kong political spectrum certainly doesn't map on to other types of political spectrum, say in the West, very easily. And there's like sort of lingering ambiguities surrounding what left means in relation to the CCP, in relation to sort of the US, for example. And so this creates a lot of historical blind spots that we're trying to unravel a little by little by all of our translating, organizing, writing work.
So speaking about nurturing a class-based analysis, so what are some of the class-based fault lines that have emerged during the Hong Kong protests?
I think, in my opinion, I think one of the things that really flew under the radar was the fact that, the very large migrant domestic worker population and migrant workers in general have been pretty sidelined by the movement. I know there's been, I do remember that there were expressions of solidarity, on both sides amongst the Han majority and also from, migrant workers themselves. But I think, that tended to be a little bit instrumentalized in the sense that it was like a lot of these ethnic minorities or migrant workers would only kind of appear into mainstream view if they supported the protests, right? Which is like, that's not really actually allowing their needs and demands and all those different things to help actually shape the movement or shape the demands, right? So there was kind of a reliance on, I think my reading of it is there was an assumption that the Han majority demands and needs represented everyone, which I don't think was the case, right? So I think, there was definitely a phenomenon where, and this was recounted in numerous outlets like, Al Jazeera, where domestic workers that worked for, so-called yellow ribbon families that went out to protest had their work and hours extended to account for like parents being out on the streets. They had to take up more work to take care of the young kids or elderly, that type of thing. Or, there were stories of, domestic workers being penalized when protests disrupted their duties or, commuting back to the home, that type of thing. So I think, we could definitely talk more about this in questions about gender, race, and citizenship. But I think this distinct lack of focus on the needs and rights of migrant workers and domestic workers, ethnic minorities, in and of themselves, not just as support for the Han majority, is something that needs to be deepened and thought more about.
Yeah, I definitely think this is one of the most important issues that Lausanne works on. And I think most importantly, my personal takeaway from this is that a lot of the forces of repression and marginalization that migrant domestic workers face, for example, also simultaneously affect people who are working class and are blue collar workers in Hong Kong. And so, for example, like since December, when there had been a huge push for unionization as a new sort of radical strategy for the pro-democracy camp, it's sort of interesting how a lot of actually like most working class or sort of blue collar workers, like sanitation workers, like cleaners and janitors, people like that, they actually don't really have the means to access information and the political education necessary for them to participate in the movement. And certainly like material conditions, like working hours, like labor protections, like those things are not infrastructures that exist for these people to participate on the same level as say someone from like a middle class background who could perhaps like a domestic worker or like a person who would provide care work. They would sort of take care of what's going on at home, and then the people could sort of go out every weekend and go protest. So that's something that is definitely not universal condition for participation in the movement. And so like we translated this interview of a sanitation worker union organizer, and what he was saying was that out of so many sanitation workers, 80,000 people in Hong Kong, a lot of them are really just sort of poverty-stricken native Hong Kongers, but a lot of them are also female mainland Chinese immigrant workers, and they're also sort of a really huge percentage of Southeast Asian, say Thai and Nepalese cleaning workers who sort of experience this asymmetry of communication and asymmetry of like political participation. And so this is, I think, where the class fault lines appear really clearly when in the thick of the protests, for example, in July and August, like people would be protesting every weekend. There would be sort of different tactics like quote unquote renovation, zhongsao, which is like sort of looting practices. But then afterwards, sort of the cleanup and the aftermath of the devastation, those things have to fall on working class and blue collar workers. And so this is something that doesn't really come on the radar for the mainstream movement. And it's sort of, I guess, an inconvenient talking point. And it sort of shows, existing tensions with the movement in terms of like who they are prioritizing and whose labor they are extracting when we're all sort of on this agenda of like supposed like pro-democracy.
Right. Yeah, I think it is definitely evident that these class-based fault lines also intersect with gender, race, and citizenship in many different ways, and they definitely are the sort of tensions that are running through the Hong Kong movement that are also, as mentioned earlier, swept under the carpet and the larger appeal to its democratic freedoms, or what we understand as democratic freedoms. So maybe to backtrack a little bit, we're speaking about the colonial inheritances of capitalist structures that are inherited by British colonial rule. So how has history perhaps informed the current Hong Kong movement, and are there historical blind spots, and why is that so?
Yeah, I have a short answer to this, I guess. I mean, as you know, Hong Kong obviously is a city made up of migrants and who settled and migrants who didn't, but also refugees from many different places, right? From the mainland and also from Vietnam. So I think that's what really informs what they call the Lion Rock spirit, right? The spirit of meritocracy, that was all about like hard work will pay off, and then you can ascend the social ladder from there. And that really grew out of the industrialization boom of the post-war era, the 50s and 60s. And it now the Lion Rock spirit, in my estimation, really kind of carries on without any material basis, right? Because from the 80s and 90s onwards, when all of the like Hong Kong was completely deindustrialized, all of the factories were moved, factories and manufacturing were moved to the mainland. And you know, I've been reading a lot about how, you know, workers who they didn't get to finish school because of the class background of their family when they were young. You know, they were taken out of school, or they couldn't afford to pay for school because, you know, back then there was no guaranteed and free education from the government. In the 50s and 60s, they had to leave school, and then they immediately went into a trade or went to work in a factory. And so, you know, at that time, you know, it was this period of like, oh, great, like I can jump from job to job. I can jump from one job to another to get a higher wage, that type of thing. But there was no social safety net. There was no kind of job protection or anything like that. And it seemed to work out very well for a couple of decades, right up until the 70s. And I think that Lion Rock spirit that was developing at that time got very deeply ingrained in the Hong Kong psyche. But, you know, after deindustrialization, then these folks who have no formal education, sometimes not even beyond high school, they were really left with nothing, and they got kind of shunted into the you know, lower rungs of society and very low wage jobs. And so I think that, you know, I think many people recognize this this state of affairs, right? The fact that no one can find a job, and even very highly educated you know, college students or whatever, find it very difficult to find a good job. But I think there is you know, what I would call kind of a historical blind spot of like how that developed from the colonial period, and how it's not, because I think there's a tendency to just make it all about, oh, okay, well, this is China's fault. And it, you know, it is to a large extent, but also being able to look back at history and say, well, actually this kind of like free market, you know, yeah, it's like a gig economy, like what we have now with like Uber and Lyft and all those different things. Basically, this kind of colonial capitalist gig economy that was developing in the post-war period, that was something that the British implemented, and I think it would be important to recognize that.
Yeah, I guess I find the notion of historical blind spot actually like really challenging to think about. And like right now I'm taking it to sort of mean, and I guess like Marcus, you can clarify later on too. And I'm taking it as sort of meaning that like some things are sort of really obvious and in plain sight, but not being interrogated as like structurally really integral to the current ranges of repression that we're experiencing. And I guess like, yeah, like one of it is certainly sort of the really deprivation of the structures of organizing labor, and the really systematic stripping away of labor rights since the colonial era. And the other thing that I feel like is really important, yeah, like really important form of colonial continuity is the not by now really popularized idea of real estate hegemony. And I think that more knowledgeable people can probably speak better about this, but I think it's really crazy personally that despite Hong Kong being literally the most unaffordable housing market in the entire world, and despite the sort of the really unacceptable and exorbitant level of like rents in Hong Kong that literally everyone has to deal with, this is something that is not really reflected in the mainstream sort of demands of the movement and the 5 demands or otherwise. And it's something that is clearly like a result of sort of the residue of colonial era institutions, like from sort of like the authorities that are being like the authorities tasked with land planning and like acquiring land. Those people are precisely the people who develop the land and are sort of like negotiating over the profiting and the extracting of these land resources. And so I think that this is something that is definitely an oversight, and I guess something that I wish had been less of a historical blind spot, not only within the movement, but just really in general, like thinking about going back to your question about class fault lines in the movement, how we can, how we can take a more holistic view and how we can sort of integrate this class analysis back into the political demands of the movement.
Right. Yeah, I think just jumping into SR's clarification, in terms of historical blind spots, I'm thinking about, you know, in the Hong Kong movement, or at least in the mainstream demands, there is a large sense of nostalgia that perhaps is encapsulated in, you know, the central protest slogan, which is 光復香港是否革命. And 光復 could mean liberate, but it also could mean restore. And there's a sense of a Hong Kong, like a colonial Hong Kong, perhaps being the golden age of some sorts, and now inching towards the future. That, you know, this golden age of colonial nostalgia is being kind of eroded. Perhaps it is a good time to turn to questions of transnational solidarity that Lau San has been thinking about and building, especially the question of imperial alignment, right? So there have been plenty of appeals towards the international, and this is perhaps also a colonial inheritance. And it's taken up many different forms during the Hong Kong protests. So for example, lobbying US Republican senators, putting up protest slogans on Shinto shrines in Japan. So what is Lau San's perspective or position to its larger geopolitics vis-a-vis the Hong Kong movement?
Yeah, I mean, I would say we don't really, I would say we don't really have an official position on that, other than we're against the inter-imperial entanglement of Hong Kong, right? Being used by the US, the UK, and China for their own purposes. You know, this was something I wanted to say at the very beginning. To one of the first questions was, I think we're a pretty big tent left progressive organization that organizes around anti-capitalism and anti-nationalism. And, you know, we really focus specifically on trying to build leftist international solidarity by connecting with anti-establishment movements from around the world. So, you know, given that description, I would say that, you know, none of us, even though our viewpoints on this question of like lobbying US Congress definitely vary amongst the collective, I would say none of us put lobbying the US government as our first priority. So I guess that might be a common point amongst all of us. And we really see cross-border solidarity as taking precedence over that. So whether that means, you know, solidarity with labor activists in the mainland, or, you know, with BLM folks in the US, or with Lebanese anti-government protesters, you know, all over. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a fair assessment. And we've done, I guess we've done work on both ends of critiquing sort of the dominant quote unquote international front of the movement via lobbying for sanctions and for sort of Western elite intervention in the forms of like declaring or undeclaring the autonomy of Hong Kong, etc. And to that end, I think like we have been able to really incorporate that angle into most of our organizing and most of our text-based work. And we've been sort of, I think we've consistently really pointed out the continuities between the right-wing turn of the movement, sort of the more conservative parts of the movement, which is by no means major. They're definitely a smaller faction of the movement. And like between that and also like the problems of attaching Hong Kong's fate toward the US's like track record of sort of their dealings with different countries around the world, and the sort of really negative aftermaths of all of those relationships, and sort of pushing toward viewing Hong Kong as a bargaining chip between the US and China in this now really popular new Cold War formation. And I think that we definitely, we're definitely, yeah, like big tent ideology, like this sort of, this sort of popular notion of brothers climbing a mountain in different ways, Hengde Pasan, that type of idea. That's something that we definitely, we definitely abide by that. At the same time, we also believe sort of constructive critique and sort of exploring different alternatives around international solidarity. That's equally important. So yeah, there's really not a one single consensus around what the perfect solution to asking for international help or extending transnational solidarity means. And likewise, there is not really a consensus like in the Hong Kong left either. And that's something that is, personally, I think that's okay. Like the Hong Kong left definitely doesn't also have a complete total like agreement about whether we should engage with this type of activism or not. But like nevertheless, this is something that's happening, and we're addressing it from the sort of the angle that we propose.
So Soulful Studs is based in Singapore, and a few of our audiences are also from around the region. And this question has been brought up several times on, what is the stake of Southeast Asian politics in tandem with Hong Kong politics. And from what I know, Lausan has also published several articles relating to Southeast Asian politics, including recently Indonesia's omnibus bills, the so-called anti-terror bill in the Philippines, and Southeast Asian politics, as we see yesterday with the Thai protests, has also been constantly compared to Hong Kong. So what are the stakes involved in bridging these connections, particularly with Hong Kong and Southeast Asia?
Sorry, I'm conscious that I'm always speaking first, so SR, if you want to jump in, please signal me somehow. But I guess I'll keep it really brief on my end. In terms of the stakes, I think this really connects to our, my previous answer about really emphasizing international anti-establishment solidarity over kind of lobbying particular governments. It's been really difficult to keep track of all of the different uprisings around the world. Like it's been difficult, but also very inspiring, obviously. Just seeing so many, and this has been brought on by, it's been exacerbated by COVID, obviously. The social chaos of, nation states failing one by one to provide for their people. There's only been, a handful of countries that have been able to do that properly. But there have been many more who prioritize profits and reopening businesses and all that stuff over protecting the people. So, I think that has really informed the number of uprisings around the world, that have gone on before COVID, but it's getting a lot more striking now. And so I think it's important that, I guess my intention with trying to comment on Southeast Asian politics and, actually bringing in activists to co-write with them based on those pieces that we publish is really to, obviously amplify their local struggle, their particular historical and material context, but also to really identify the commonalities between our movements, which is, what is exactly causing these things, these oppressions and the suffering. And obviously, the conclusion that we come to is that it's, the state, and it's also capitalism. And we've been able to really kind of draw this really clear line across all these movements without kind of oversimplifying them. But to show that these common elements are things that we can organize around. And that is the more we highlight those elements, the more we're able to show the illegitimacy of these governments, right? Because the you know, it's being taken for granted that we need to take the nation state form as like the political container, you know, through which we think about politics. But I think the fact that all these nation states are failing is showing us that that doesn't have to be the case.
Yeah, what I'll add to that already really comprehensive answer is that I think for me personally, I constantly think of how Lausanne is not really an outlet that just propagates some type of Hong Kong exceptionalist perspective, wherein we are taking Hong Kong as the only position of critique. And we're not really saying that, hey, you know, Hong Kong is situated between all these empires, all these colonial regimes, and therefore this yields a unique or one-of-a-kind type of vantage point into all of these really shared and really rapidly multiplying problems of sort of the capitalist classes across multiple different states, colluding with militarized police, colluding with basically the authorities to continue to dispossess workers, to continue to wreak environmental havoc and sort of abuse emergency powers in this really unprecedented time. And so this sort of idea of pushing against an exceptionalism of Hong Kong as a position of critique is really important to me. And Jan is probably too humble to talk about this, but he's definitely at the forefront of our sort of editorial work toward linking up all of these different adjacent struggles between the Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore, and Hong Kong, and sort of using this framework of the state of emergency to really tease out all of these really long-term relationships of dominance, of collusion between like these different powers, and how actually these states are collaborating. These states are borrowing tactics from each other in order to sort of further, you know, deprive people of the rights they have, the protections they have, and that's already, you know, really abysmal. And so I think that this is really, like, in terms of stakes, I think it's really important that we continuously make these connections. I think the right now, like, our very modest effort is really just covering a very small cut of the pie of like this whole situation. I was earlier this week, I was reading this really reprehensible opinion piece on the New York Times, actually, about how Vietnam is this new, like, asking whether Vietnam is the next Asian miracle, which is obviously alluding to sort of the neoliberal miracles of the post-colonial sort of Asian paradigm of Singapore and Hong Kong and etc. And so in this piece, like, people were talking about how sort of the functioning of autocratic or authoritarian capitalism is actually quote unquote like running surprisingly well, because it contributes so much to growth. It contributes so much to sort of this smooth running of the like financialized capitalism without intervention, without oversight. And this is something that I think that we are trying to push against, especially in the sphere of Southeast Asia and in East Asia. Like, we're not really, we're very aware that this is the aftermath of decades and decades of colonial sort of control. And this is something that people are continuously, like, this is still being cast as like what people think of when they think of Singapore, Hong Kong, Vietnam, Korea, Taiwan, etc. Like, we're being thought of as like these like neoliberal sort of centers of international like financial exchange and sort of like this like facilitating system of global capital. And so I think like the stakes is that we're trying to clarify that in all of these sites, even though they have been sort of, they share sort of different, but really under a larger umbrella of like sort of a colonial experience. Like, we're still trying to say, hey, you know, people are speaking out about this. A decolonial, a leftist perspective exists in all of these different places. And I think that in the context of COVID-19, in the context of all of these uprisings right now, like, we're just trying to insert Hong Kong into the conversation. Like, we're not saying that you know, Hong Kong has a unique or Hong Kong has a solution, or Hong Kong has a special premium on sort of what it means to organize decentralized struggles and whatever. Like we're sort of trying to just yeah, put this into a larger history, put it like sort of put it alongside all of these different movements, different organizers, and etc.
So
yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
sorry. Yeah, I think that's really important, especially for us here in Singapore, something to think about, because so often we're really isolated and insulated from things happening around the world, right? Or even really close to us, just in the region. And it can seem like Singapore is some kind of paradise, really. Also going back to what Jayan was talking about in relation to the nation state form as a kind of model, like Singapore is often taken as a model, right? Even with the current pandemic, although as we know, it has failed in really massive ways, which Lausan has also really, I think, which is something I appreciate, it has published a really good piece, I think in June, about the racist response to the situation in the migrant worker dorms here. Yeah, just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and honestly, like it's so appalling because just yesterday or the day before, like I don't know if other people saw this, that like there's this announcement of like there's gonna be a Hong Kong Singapore travel bubble, because like they're sort of like trying to facilitate like all of these like air travel arrangements that would have been, you know, like I mean Hong Kong and Singapore, like there's no slowing down of the sort of the freewheeling flows of capital or whatever. And so it's so ridiculous that like, you know, like in both of these sites, migrant workers, people who are sort of not equipped or not given enough support as working class people, as immigrants, whatever, they are sort of being sidelined yet again in this like new sort of accelerated response to COVID-19, which is like, of course we know this like disproportionately impacts racialized people more than others. And so it's yeah, this is something that I think we're taking fairly seriously, and we're trying to continue developing these perspectives with different writers that are actually from Singapore, from Thailand, from the Philippines. And yeah, I'm really glad to hear that this was a good piece.
Right. Perhaps to elaborate more on transnational solidarity, but also how it's operationalized. Perhaps you could move or turn to the politics of translation or aesthetics. So translation, I know, is a very big part of Lausan's work. So I'm just wondering, how do decisions about translation lend themselves to, say, the collective's political aspirations?
Yeah, for sure. It's been a really big part of Lausan from the very beginning, because we started out just finding each other in online spaces, collaborating on making available sort of local news and statements and petitions and whatever about the protests toward a more sort of international audience. And so from the very get-go, we were together, like really based on this labor of translation, and we're treating it as a collective sort of commitment to the movement of trying to amplify what's happening on the ground. And so this is something that is embedded within the very practice of Lausan, as not only just a tool for disseminating information, but also as a political commitment. And so we continue doing this today in several ways. And I think it's a really pressing question about the means of sort of making international solidarity happen by sort of intervening into these different language and media contexts. And so, yeah, I mean, like very interestingly, like in December, the Indonesian migrant worker, Yuli Rizwati, who had, like, she basically started this media platform, Migrant Pos, for fellow migrant workers in Hong Kong, which is like really sizable as a population. Like it's just like the second largest migrant worker population in Hong Kong. And so those people don't really have good access to information about the protests, like, or for that matter, any like development in Hong Kong politics. And so for this person to translate and to write in English and in Bahasa Indonesia about the protests, about sort of what's happening on the ground, it's something that's clearly touched a nerve for a lot of people. And she was ultimately deported back to Indonesia in December after a stint at the really notorious immigration detention center, Kaso Peak Bay, which is sort of like, I think some people may have seen this on the news, that like they're going through this 100+ day hunger strike that is bringing attention to a lot of migrant worker, refugee, and sort of sex worker cases that are sort of suppressed in the media. And so that's like just a little anecdote of like what we're, the exact stakes of what translation in Lausanne is really dealing with. And so one of the really challenging things, I think, is really living up to our tagline, which is quote unquote sharing decolonial left perspectives on Hong Kong. And I think this sharing is really complicated. And earlier I was looking at the Softball Studs projects, and actually really appreciated two terms that you guys have when it comes to sort of organizing support and mutual aid and supporting cultural workers in Singapore and otherwise. And those two terms are amplifications and recirculations. And I really appreciate it. Like, I mean, we're dealing with totally different sort of urgent and emergency contexts, obviously, but I do feel like these two concepts are sort of resonant and sort of something that we heavily subscribe to as well, because we are not only just sort of putting out new information, or we're not just producing new things to be consumed as text or objects or materials, but you're sort of situating and recontextualizing different projects, different asks, different needs alongside each other. And this is something that we're committed to doing as well. We're trying to amplify existing perspectives that local leftists have already been propagating since forever. We're trying to situate them alongside original writing and research in primarily an Anglophone context. And we're trying to disseminate those things as co-eval and co-constitutive. Like we're not saying that one, like translated texts or translated perspectives have any sort of higher level of authenticity or higher level of sort of like proving that there are, like, we're not using those things as burdens of proof to show everyone that, hey, there are leftist voices currently active in Hong Kong. We're sort of trying to really hone in on the idea that these anti-capitalist critiques actually exist everywhere, and that translation is one of the ways in which we can position it alongside other sort of analyses. And so primarily trying to live up to this sharing decolonial left perspectives from Hong Kong thing, we've been, so we see like, we see this as like operating in both directions of translating outwards, which is sort of talking about the situation of the Hong Kong left, the challenges faced by the Hong Kong left, and how we can rectify or how we can improve that situation. Because I think that it's fairly universal knowledge that like these leftist voices are already subdued in the mainstream movement and sort of the media ecology of Twitter and other types of like online forums, where those voices are not necessarily already occupying the same space as more sort of I guess vigorous ideas like Lam Tao, like the mutually assured destruction idea. Like, I mean, so these things are, we put a lot of labor into working with members in Lausanne and volunteers at Lausanne to sort of position these voices in equal standing. So making it available and heard, first of all, but also not as some sort of, like not to use like, not to make it available in English to show that this is an authoritative thing that we have to hold over local discourse, but that this deserves to be heard by a lot of audiences, no matter where they are. So that's translating outwards. Like we're really interested in doing this too. And we don't have a shortage of analyses or perspectives coming from the Hong Kong left either. There are a bunch of publications that are constantly working with us on translating these perspectives. And yeah, they include the OWL, they include Reignite Press, like lots of these outlets. And so we work with them really closely. And I think that they also, we have sort of like a really collaborative relationship where they also post or request us to do certain translations of certain things, to broadcast certain different analyses to broader audiences. And so we're glad to do that for them. And so there's like another perspective, I guess, like later on after the heat of the movement in 2019 was sort of over, is that we're trying to start translating in words, which is to take really prescient and salient lessons and resources and perspectives from other struggles around the world that maybe don't exist yet or don't really get traction in Hong Kong back toward the context of the movement. And so these things might include boosting like sort of emergent voices or ideas around, like I was saying, police abolition in Hong Kong, and supplementing it and sort of trying to, make available these other traditions like, the Black radical tradition, the work of Black liberation, and the work of Black liberation activists, and try to make a connection between the conversation happening organically out of the encounter with police violence in Hong Kong, but also perhaps Black Lives Matter in the US, right? So this is something that we are, this is a little bit more difficult, like translating mostly English stuff back toward Chinese, because the media discourse environment in Hong Kong already gives us a sort of sidelined position vis-a-vis Hong Kong sort of mainstream media. Like it's really hard to let alone us, right? Like, because local Hong Kong leftists already have a hard time making their voices heard on perhaps things like rent strikes, tenant organizing, labor organizing, etc. Like they're already having a hard time getting heard. And so we're also trying to, at the same time, make our presence known and amplify those things alongside their voices in the Hong Kong Sinophone context. And so, like all that to say is that we are always sort of caring about three things, which is always sort of contextualizing where our text is coming from, and secondly, the sites that it includes, and also finally, who is reading this text in this media and language context. So I'm very sort of adamant about this aspect of translation, because I don't think that it's not just a means to produce knowledges that are to be consumed by the Western left, right? Like we're not just sort of putting on all of this knowledge on display just so that we're proving that, hey, this exists in Hong Kong and therefore we're deserving of a certain type of solidarity or a certain degree of solidarity. But that I think these oppressed and marginalized voices are already existing, and we're sort of acting as translators and editors, we're acting as facilitators, and we're putting those conversations together in the same space. So yeah, that's sort of the general why we translate situation.
Yeah, thanks for that very comprehensive response to its translation. Perhaps now we could also turn to aesthetics, and we have an audience question from the Google Forms. What role can aesthetics provide in reorganizing our relationships to power? And this person identifies as an artist, so they are posing this question to the organizers from a personal perspective.
Hi, so maybe I can speak to this from the Lausanne perspective of things, because I think that's like broadly related. And I'm going to focus on talking about online visual elements, since it's been so long since we've done offline visual work. And anyway. So regarding the question, I'm thinking about BLM and a lot of like different movements that had happened over the last few months that can only occur online, whether it's protest organizations or spreading the news to different parts of the world. Me, myself, I mostly get my information through Instagram, through like memes, through those like accounts. And without the kind of artwork that you're talking about, or like the, sorry, I'm like not good at doing these kind of stuff. But let me see. Like, I feel like having something that's like visually attractive to look at is like a first step to like catch someone's attention, whether that's like a topic that you're interested or not. And for people who are already familiar with the kind of information or messages that we're trying to broadcast, they will already like be receiving them through their social circles or like through their usual mediums one way or another. But for people who are like remotely interested in the idea or like want to play with it, or are just open to receiving ideas in general, I feel like the aesthetic component is where the strength really comes in, because it baits people into looking at it, whether it's like cute, random, blobby characters or like vibrant color stuff. It just like provides people a means to look at it through like a lighter lens, like for example, when we're talking about like less plastic, like Zhou, you hear that and you're like, I don't want to look at it, I don't want to listen to it. But if it's something that seems approachable, or like seems like something that's like pretty okay looking, that you might want to share on your story, or like makes you want to like look at it for like even 2 seconds more, that already like gives you more information than this really dense article online that won like a 5-star from some random writers award or something that you would never like indulge yourself in. So I think that's where the power really comes in.
And I'm wondering, what are some sort of, I guess, stereotypical aesthetic representations of the Hong Kong protests, and perhaps how this considerations about visual elements kind of in Lawson's work kind of counter that?
I can also go for this one. So when we add, so when you go on Lausanne.hk, this is our promotion now. When you go on our website, you'll see a lot of photos as like the feature images with our articles, and sometimes there are illustrations, mostly unfortunately done by me. You're welcome to join for like the artist person who asked the question earlier if you're around. Anyway, so when we add visual elements to Lausanne work, we usually consider most heavily on how to add visual cues to help readers and audience understand our ideas, ideas that may be dense or difficult to unpack. Like we had done talks before with Alex Chow, the former student leader, where we had like PowerPoint slides in the back of the presenter panels. And we had like the blobby characters that I talked about earlier that represents like collective actions or students, organizers, to illustrate what happened during what period of time to help people to like absorb the information in, especially when it's like super dense and within like such a short amount of time. And with like other visual elements, we also look at the atmosphere of the context. And whenever possible, we try to put up something that's like fun to create and hopefully fun to look at, and ideally attract people who wouldn't normally look at it, like I said before. But mostly to like make visual connections on multiple verses, like as I said earlier with our translation work as well. Let me see. So I'm sure people have seen like protest posters or like monsoon, those like promotional graphics on like Hong Kong protests before. And I try to not refer to them, or like there are very few times where I do refer to like the generic, or not generic, but like the more commonly seen protest aesthetics, especially the Hong Kong protest posters. But it's completely out of selfish reasons. Like for example, a couple months ago, if you can remember, Animal Crossing was like very on trend, and I was not into it. like I was very invested in quote unquote cracking it and like collect as many items in the game as possible. But back to the question, there were a lot of Animal Crossing Hong Kong protest memes around back then with users spelling out solidarity or protest slogans using props in the games or dress as the characters in protest, dress the characters in protest gears and screenshotting those and reshare them online. And I just felt like I needed an excuse to make an Animal Crossing related graphic. So I did look up a lot of those like Animal Crossing protest creations online and created one based on those to serve as one of our articles feature image. But otherwise, I tend to not refer to them too much, or I feel like there'll be like an aesthetic fatigue to it. Like I don't want everything to look the same or feel the same. And I want there to be some difference between when it's information like a gathering that like an emergency gathering that anyone who could make to it should make to it, and like official cue to accompany an article that you're like learning some more analytical views about or like more perspective into like the same incident about. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I can also add to the conversation about what aesthetics can do for a movement context, or yeah, basically how is it sort of politically relevant or whatever. And I think that doing Lausan work, a lot of this this question comes up constantly for me, because I think that when we encounter cultural criticism, that people assume that aesthetics is an aftermath of politics, or that aesthetics somehow, or cultural production or visual production of any kind, sort of that never precedes political movement or never precedes any type of material or like realistic action of politics. And it sort of lends itself into, I think, this really disingenuous and sort of false binary of whether aesthetics have anything at all to do with politics. Because I mean, we're dealing with so many images every day about the Hong Kong movement, and as a media and sort of organizing effort, like Lausan is constantly having to sort through these like quote unquote aesthetics of the Hong Kong movement, and like it comes into so many of our different conversations. It's and it becomes this question of representation that we constantly have to grapple with. And like, I mean, for instance, I think that part of the spiel I gave about this bourgeois imagination of the Hong Konger identity sort of is also, in my opinion, it's sort of linked towards certain aspects of the movement being visualized or being amplified as a spectacle, or as a sort of really technologically advanced type of movement. And so we see images like the Baltic Way or the Hong Kong Way, like lights sort of lining the most famous sites of Hong Kong, on the Lion Rock, on the Peak, whatever. Those images, and also, yeah, like laser parties at the Science Museum, those things like sort of portray the movement as yeah, in this very specific cyberpunk imagination. And I think that in some ways it's sort of confounding, because when people put the movement into this imagination, they're also conjuring up like really distinct understandings of like the relationship between Asia and the future, and sort of ultimately creating this like Orientalist and sort of yeah, like really racialized and nationalized image of certain brands of protests. And so these things, I think, affect how people understand the movement, and therefore how they understand solidarity. And there are like more grounded examples as well. Like we were translating a piece by Hong Kong anarchists about how graffiti and the phenomenon of London walls in Hong Kong are pretty much sort of diametrically opposed forms of visual intervention, because London walls in the original iteration, like in the Czech Republic, like that had been sort of done in a more intrusive way, whereas in Hong Kong, like people do it with post-its and sort of like easily removable elements that like ultimately makes for a really sort of that ephemeral or really sort of yeah, transitional type of medium of visual production. And so it sort of points toward how Hong Kong people imagine their claim to public space and their right to the city. Like they're thinking these post-its are temporary, so they can stick it up. They can sort of do a gesture based on this type of limited temporality. But then they don't think about sort of doing maybe graffiti, because graffiti is sort of, even if you erase graffiti, even if you sort of try to hide it or whatever, like it still has a mark. Like if I think that, yeah, there's been a lot of instances of anti-gentrification protests in Hong Kong, or other types of anti-art washing types of campaigns in Hong Kong that had used graffiti to sort of reclaim people's yeah, hold over the city, over capitalist interests and whatever. And so between like these different types of visual interventions in the movement, I think that you can really see how people imagine their place and how people imagine their relationship to one another, and also to the sort of spatial politics that already like constantly contextualize how we do our political movements. And so, yeah, I mean, like as an artist, like I myself also, like I'm not an artist, like I used to have a studio background, and also yeah, sort of more curatorial interests. Like I'm really concerned about these ideas of representation, like how people in certain movements create certain images and certain impressions of what we're doing in order to create specific imaginaries, like identity, like nationality, like how we do solidarity. And so this is sort of how I think about this question. Yeah.
I think we can also kind of address this a little. Yeah, Marcus. So I think going back to the question, in terms of like aesthetics, the role of aesthetics in relation to reorganizing our relationship to power, right? I think it's really definitely crucial to see that, well, because usually, typically protest graphics and symbolisms can often be so solemn, right? Or even heteronormative in many ways, like, and also the way that, say, information is presented or infographics. So on the level of where form meets content, I think there's so much that can be done, so much that we can kind of reassess, right? But I think what's also really important is in thinking about reorganizing a relationship to power, is that it's important to locate where one stands or positions oneself, or sees art or aesthetics within an emancipatory horizon or political project. So for myself as an artist, I don't really think of art as the way, the means to change things, because I don't think that's possible actually. But it's a tool, right? It's a tool amongst many that needs to kind of work together to create those imaginations, or to try to materialize them in life, really. Yeah, and I think that's part of kind of what Softwall Stats tries to do, although not always explicitly or in a very, very, yeah, we don't call it out as such. But I think there's an undercurrent of thinking through that manner.
For sure. I think like my interest in you guys' work at Softwall Studs is that you don't really, you're not really situating cultural production as something that is to be marketed and commodified or consumed in any way, but that you're thinking of it as a site of labor and a site of sort of collective, collective commitment to any type of like, for example, I was looking at Beyond Repair, right? Like the sort of urgent response project that you guys were doing, and that so many of those actions and interventions like do not necessarily, I wouldn't even think to have to limit it to art per se, because I think that it's so limiting. And actually I would say, like, even in the context of Hong Kong and Singapore, like where the, I don't know, I just get really cynical about art market politics in both of these cities, because like constantly, like there's a drive toward institutionalizing or sort of freezing or like freeze framing certain aspects or material cultures or sort of archives of objects from moments of resistance into these like digestible forms that can later be marketed and situated in this like international supply chain of art objects. And I think that this is something that is certainly happening. Like I can't say for Singapore, but for Hong Kong, certainly happening. And there was this like really terrible article someone wrote that I was really shocked by, like at the height of the protests, which was about how the protests and the political turmoil had been conducive to the health of the art market, basically, and how Art Basel is profiting and sort of given this like new taste of politics, of like social practice or whatever, because of what's happening in the city that's hosting Art Basel. And I think that is precisely this kind of really aberrant idea of visual production that really makes me really makes me balk at understandings of first of all, like making art, making cultural products out of a movement in the aftermath of a movement, and secondly also sometimes with archiving or collecting different objects as a way to document or to create a narrative around a certain sort of moment of discrepancy or of disruption. And I think it's like super perverse. And I think, I'm sure it's happening in Singapore too. I'm just not really sure which institutions or which players are involved. But I think that this is something that I think for Lausanne, I heavily push against that type of understanding of art. And yeah, I was also gonna say, so this type of visual culture works in the opposite direction a lot of times. I think like one translation that we did about sort of facing down the right-wing turn of the movement, people were talking about how at one point of the movement, it was very popular to basically link imagery and sort of the rhetoric of Nazism to the CCP type of repression. And so that like sort of engendered a really, really quite shocking type of deluge of Nazi imagery and Nazi like language that's being like really freely allowable in the public sphere. And it's like weirdly, it coincides with also like in Hong Kong, the prominence of otaku and anime culture being like something that gels very well with like online right-wing spaces, and also this persistent move to frame the movement as like fascist and right-wing based on like a few people wearing MAGA hats or whatever. And so like I think that all that is to say that these visual elements or these like ideas and challenges of representation is not just like superfluous or not just something that we consider after the fact of protest, right? We're talking about it happening in real time and influencing and impacting how people think of Hong Kong or Singapore or whatever in real time. And so, yeah, that's sort of like my rant in relation to this.
Yeah, thank you for your responses. Yeah, with regards to soft wall stats, definitely, as Godwin mentioned, I mean, our earlier days were probably characterized as playing around with the politics of legibility and perhaps riffing off SR's point, so much of that clarity can also be so easily digestible and easily commodified. But I guess more recently, and specific to the Beyond Repair projects, we're looking towards considering aesthetics and the infrastructures, surrounding aesthetics in its production, in the sustenance of aesthetics as a kind of labor almost, and looking deeper and thinking deeper into what are sort of structures that make it possible to or to compel us to keep producing aesthetically, right? And yeah, perhaps now it's a good time to move towards the Q&A section of the meeting. Does anyone perhaps from the audience might have a question for the panelists or for the organizers? Feel free to type in the chat. Unmute yourself.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for this great talk. It was very informative, and I really appreciate the work that Lausan does in terms of centering labor and working class people in Hong Kong. And also thank you to now introducing me to the work of Soft Walls. Just browsed your website, very interesting stuff. I'm interested in aesthetics as well, and the an aesthetic production, cultural production as a labor practice. And in particular, I'm interested in how some of the aesthetic practices developed in Hong Kong and that have been really, really fine-tuned in this time of, staying at home and like not going out, how these very fine-tuned aesthetic practices can contribute to the these movements, and how they can be powerful tools in the movements, both in the form of viral images, which I posit viral images sort of as like a subversive image, as it cannot be commodified. At least not easily, it can be, but as a more subversive image that is more difficult to commodify. So how do you guys see the aesthetic practices in Hong Kong changing and shaping? In particular, I'm interested in how anti-monument and new forms of monument can be built in subversive ways to memorialize and create sites of collective memory. Sorry if that was unclear. I was just kind of talking.
No, I think that's a great question, and I'll just take a stab at it. I really I haven't thought too meticulously about questions of how visual production has changed and transitioned from earlier on, perhaps in 2019, toward a new reality of quarantine and sort of this new situation of separation and etc. And I feel like, it's the monument idea, I think was very prevalent for me, at least like in the earlier sort of public space practices in the protests, and it's very clear that people are sort of operating in both monument and anti-monument practices, and that the question of how to manipulate and how to sort of appropriate or take back public space is really crucial. And so many artists and so many sort of urban politics practitioners in Hong Kong have talked about how certain forms of intervention, like barricades, removing the sort of really annoying metal fences all around Hong Kong, and sort of how like these like gestures of simultaneously very realistically deterring police advancements, and also at the same time operating as like this like growing archive of like tactics of occupying space, is something like a new type of monumentality in its own right. And at the same time, it's anti-monument, I guess, in 2019, like for me personally, like I associated this idea of monument to 2014 sort of mimicries or sort of aspirations toward building like goddesses of democracy in the image of 1989 Tiananmen Square protesters work, and also sort of like these really mega visible or like really monumentally scaled anthropomorphic type of interventions in public space. Like I think that in 2019, like things like going along with the more decentralized and radical and anonymous tactics of the movement, like so to have these visual elements of how people how people intervene into space and how people sort of change the conditions of navigation and of movement. And so that strikes me as not a coincidence. And I think that I'm also wondering right now, after the July sort of instantiation of the national security laws, obviously so many of these visual elements of protests have now been outlawed, right? 光復香港時代革命, that is no longer something that can legally appear as something in public. And so, so I mean, this is like everyone can see this. Like this is very quotidian, and this is very like everyone can do this. Like so, there's so in some ways like this goes against sort of this like idea of like specialists or artists or craftsmen having to be able to sort of make these really technical or like labor intensive type of interventions in the form of monuments or really impressive type of more stereotypically art object type things in public, right? Because people now are holding up blank pieces of paper. People are now sort of more focusing on the residual or like sort of the remainder of what could have been visual and language elements of the protests. We're looking at this shift towards looking at almost this like documenting the detritus of making images in public and the failure of doing that under the national security laws. And so, yeah, I think that for me, that has been sort of the change under very undesirable circumstances that in 2014, that was sort of, the monuments had been something that was much more prevalent as a, as a mechanism of image or visual production. But then now, like, this is something that is no longer possible, is no longer allowable. And as I said earlier, I think this sort of mirrors or even prefigures much of the political and cultural developments of the protests after. Hope that's like a non-BS answer.
No, that was really great. I wanted to get to ideas of like public-private space articulation, and just my mind is not functioning fully right now. So yeah.
Can I tag on really quickly to that answer, which was, really brilliant. I just want to add also that, I think there was, at least from the Western reception of the Hong Kong protests, there was kind of this fetishization of like the masses, just like, swarms of people, innumerable amounts of people, that type of thing, as a way to, legitimize the movement, right? And I think that comes from a very distinctly kind of like Marxist leftist perspective of fetishizing the masses, right? Fetishizing the people. And, we are kind of a left progressive collective, but I think we can also turn the lens back on people that might extend a solidarity and also kind of question the way they aestheticize the movement. Like SR was referencing earlier with the cyberpunk thing, that was like a really big thing in anarchist and kind of like vitalist circles, was kind of like, ooh, look at the lasers, look at the gas mask, like this is the future, blah, blah, blah. And it was a very shallow engagement, shallow aesthetic engagement with the movement. And so now this kind of like the fact that the masses, quote unquote, the visual representation of the masses is being clamped down on multiple angles, right? From COVID and the national security law. And resistance now necessarily must be more private, more, less monumental, I guess, to use one of the terms that was used earlier. it's going to be an open question whether or not there's still going to be this support and solidarity from leftists in the West as well.
Thank you. That was really useful. And just one final thing. I do work related to this. Is there a way you would prefer to be cited? I know maybe you're trying to stay anonymous, so I'll just say like.
Just cite like this video link when Marcus posts it later, I think.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience? Feel free to type in the chat as well. Perhaps one audience question from the Google Forums is ways Asian, and I quote, ways Asian and other progressives in the US can support the HK struggle. But perhaps to extend the question a bit further, how can someone outside of Hong Kong, say in Singapore or in the larger region, Southeast Asia, relate or involve even themselves in the Hong Kong movement or struggle?
Wait, sorry, could you repeat that question really quickly?
Right. So the question from the Google Forums, an audience question is, ways Asian and other progressives in the US can support the Hong Kong struggle, but also to extend it beyond the US, how can someone generally outside from Hong Kong, say in Singapore and Southeast Asia, relate, involve themselves in the Hong Kong struggle or the general work that Lau San has been doing?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways, and I think so many people would have different answers on this. But I guess for me, one of my focuses is thinking about the misrepresentations of Hong Kong in whatever circles it happens to be, leftist or otherwise, in terms of thinking about Hong Kong, representing Hong Kong as like all bourgeois, all bootlickers of the US or whatever, CIA funded, Ed funded, that type of thing. And I think one of the really important things that folks in the diaspora can do is correct that misinformation, right? Because, as we're seeing, there's many outlets springing up specifically in the diaspora, like they label themselves diasporic groups, which, Lausan has we have a mixed ambivalent relationship to the term diaspora, but there are other kind of groups that are more pro PRC who label themselves as, diasporic, whatever. And they're very intent on spreading this idea, an anti-Hong Kong perspective, right? That Hong Kong belongs to China, that there's we're part of its territory, and Hong Kong protesters are rioters, etc. And this kind of misinformation is spreading, and it's spreading under more insidious guises, I would say. So like there's this website called Pivot to Peace. Some of you may have come across this site already, but it's just a bunch of quote unquote leftists who are their sole focus is to talk about US aggression against China, which is a real thing, and it's something that Lausan also condemns, right? Like we're absolutely against US war on China, but they completely whitewash and kind of gloss over the fact that the PRC is also kind of a growing imperialist and colonial power, right? So they're aggressive in the South China Seas. They're a colonial power in Xinjiang, where they're currently enacting cultural genocide, all these different facts, right? But these groups like Pivot to Peace only want to focus on US aggression to make it seem as if China is only the victim here. So I think that's one thing I think that's a really important part of diasporic activism that I'm invested in, is to try and correct these narratives or counter these narratives. Yeah.
Well, I think another part of supporting the Hong Kong struggle is also, to me, it means simultaneously also supporting similar or adjacent type of organizing efforts, whether they're Hong Kong related or not. And for one thing, I think what I would really like to see for people who are interested in the struggle in Hong Kong is sort of to yeah, like conduct more political education on sort of mainland China and Hong Kong cross-border solidarity. I think this is something that often doesn't really land on the radar of a lot of people who are concerned about Hong Kong, but Hong Kong is sort of a sort of hub and a sort of major site of facilitation for all types of labor organizing in mainland China that of course now is increasingly jeopardized and threatened by these new ranges of repression from the CCP and so on and so forth. And I think this is one aspect that I think would be really important moving forward for supporting the Hong Kong struggle, because there's not really legitimate support for Hong Kong without also supporting folks on mainland fighting for much of the same thing and against much of the same forces. And so this is one thing that I really encourage. And then the other thing is also, check out some of these really awesome initiatives happening in Southeast Asia and in East Asia. Recently, there have been a bunch of new folks who formed collectives around organizing similar issues in their respective sites. And later on, I can post in the chat like what to sort of follow and how to support them and stuff. But I think that again, like supporting Hong Kong is not necessarily saying to prioritize Hong Kong as a site of struggle or to position it as sort of more urgent or more important to highlight than any other sites per se. For me, I think that, yeah, like Jan was talking about, correcting misinformation is also something integral toward allowing for and sort of welcoming even the existence of complexity and to open up room for experimentation and failure, and also, yeah, like sort of improvisation around what this whole struggle can go toward. And so, yeah, all that to say is that we think that it would be really great if people could support Hong Kong by making the connection between all of these movements, all of these organizations, and also to, yeah, not really single it out in any special way.
Yeah, thank you for your responses. Also, turning back to the audience, are there any other questions? Now's the time to ask them.
Yeah, excuse me, can I add something?
Yep.
Thank you very much. Yeah, can I just build on the two comments that have just been made? I think as Joshua Wong said, Hong Kong has become the new Berlin. It's become the sort of a boundary between freedom, democracy, and authoritarianism. So yeah. So I think that ties in with the comments just now that Hong Kong has become this hub where different forces have come in. And I think one thing that we haven't addressed enough in this meeting is that it's a variation. So the whole sort of anti-bill movement, as well as the umbrella movement, it's probably much more varied and much more complex than the Western media make it look like. I mean, the media, which do have the somewhat anti-China bias, they portray it as a freedom movement. They portray the umbrella movement persons as a freedom fighters. Some of them even as martyrs. When actually, it's probably a bit more complex than that. I mean, there is an element of freedom fighting, but at the same time, there's a lot of tribalism and a lot of anti-China sentiments that that are really quite ugly. The same goes for the whole Taiwan, so the sunflower movement. as well. Is you know, I mean, it's all fine to fight for democracy and free speech, etc. But when that turns into tribalism and regionalism, discrimination against mainland Chinese, it all becomes quite ugly. So I think the one thing that we should perhaps address a bit more is this idea of a variation. The fact that there is some good elements that are clearly noble, but there are also some other elements that's the foreign media leave out in order to make it sound more romantic. When actually if we sort of look deeper and visit the various fora like the LIHK. I've seen many sort of many sort of anti-China remarks that are really not appropriate. I think.
To cut you off, do you have a question specifically?
Yeah. So I was trying to address. I was trying to ask what everyone here thinks about the variation. The variation in the whole Hong Kong movement. It's not simple. Freedom versus tyranny, isn't it?
Just to jump in.
Yeah, please.
I think this is actually really well documented and addressed within Lau San's work already, actually. So I don't know how familiar you are with the pieces they've published or they've translated. They're that's already out there.
Sure, yeah, because
about
I've
authoritarian tendencies and right-wing tendencies within the movement, and critiques of that. So I'm not really sure why you think that that's not being addressed.
Oh, okay, yeah, I was just referring to this particular meeting. I haven't heard enough that convinced me that there's a bit more to the picture. I haven't read all of your papers online, so I better do that. Yeah, thank you.
Cool. And there's an audience question from the chat, which goes, I quote, thoughts on how documentary as a medium could support transnational solidarity efforts. And they tend to fall into shortened portrayals and the outsider gaze.
Sorry, I only caught the end of that question. Something about the outsider gaze.
Yep. So the question is basically thoughts on documentary as a medium that could support transnational solidarity efforts. Perhaps are you referring to specifically Hong Kong protests or Hong Kong protests in relation to other uprisings across the world? And perhaps because documentary tends to fall into shortened portrayals or the outsider gaze as a medium. Yeah. So the question is in the chat.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I see it on the chat there now. I guess for me, I'm not a practitioner or anything. I'm not a filmmaker, but I guess in terms of seeing documentaries, having watched documentaries on Hong Kong, I think, there was a series of documentaries that focused on Joshua Wong as a figure. And, I had talked with the documentary maker a bit, and I think he has a more complex understanding of Hong Kong than the documentaries allow. So I think this is getting to what your question is just like the genre and the form of documentary itself. And, I think necessarily, there was a whole issue with kind of like parachute journalists who would come in and like write all these pieces and then kind of make their name in this kind of like quote unquote war zone type atmosphere. And it definitely does encourage shortened portrayals and the outsider gaze, as you say, Ashley. And I think it's especially exacerbated when you want to, film a documentary that's based on one figure, right? I think it's totally fine to kind of document an individual, but when you're filtering an entire movement through one person, that's not actually, it might have been accurate to what Joshua was doing in like 2012 or something, but it's not accurate to to read that into the 29 protests, right? Obviously, because there was the specific ethos of, you know, no big stage, no political leaders, that type of thing. So I think this was one of the ways in which the narrative was warped, possibly through documentary in the diaspora, was people were like, okay, Nathan Law, Joshua Wong, these are the protest leaders, quote unquote. And these two people happen to have connections with the National Endowment for Democracy, that type of thing. And it was a very easy way to kind of just gloss over all the complexity in the movement and just say, these two people are bad because X. And I think those two documentaries on Joshua probably had something to do with it. Yeah.
Yeah, I also I don't really have a cut and dried answer about the genre per se. I'll just say this, that sometimes I feel like certainly, yeah, like Jan was talking about, the sort of almost ethnographic gaze of someone who is not really embedded in the movement and the context of the movement as such, is trying to now create a narrative around it. And it reminded me of like basically Ai Weiwei in the earlier stages of the movement. He's doing his typical sort of parachuting thing into Hong Kong and talking about how basically like he is trying to so he's trying to make a project about the 2019 protests and whatever. And for me, I guess like I'm more interested in how documentaries are circulated as evidence and as this sort of legitimate or an authoritative document about protests, and how it's very much intertwined with what I was talking about earlier, which is the circulations of capital within the art market and within the art world in general, and how perhaps figures like Ai Weiwei, who have been sort of lauded as this figure of this like really basically like the most prominent Chinese socially engaged artist / filmmaker, and how people like Ai Weiwei like continue to profit off of and sort of like build on top of this identity of like the artist as activist, or the artist as someone who's engaged in dissent. And yeah, so it made me think of like the person who's the filmmaker, who's the ethnographer, and how he or she or they are wrapped up in these sort of dynamics of neoliberal visual production, of how they have propriety over the content and the form of visualizing protest, visualizing a movement. And so that's what I sort of think about the genre and how it's situated. Another thing is, so I wanted to just shout out this film that actually two people had made, and I don't know if it's still on view in Hong Kong, but they're in an exhibition at Parasite called A Garden of Six Seasons, and the artists Bo Wang and Pan Lu, they made a film basically about the colonial histories of gardens and ecology in Hong Kong, and sort of talk about how logistics and infrastructures of basically managing human bodies have everything to do with the British colonial sort of presence in Hong Kong, and how it sort of is still seen in different types of I guess rhythms and patterns of the city today, like how on Sunday migrant workers sort of go occupy spaces in the city as a result of these like lingering structures of labor and structures of exploitation that of course is a result of like these really long attendant political structures of exploitation and deprivation. So I just want to shout out that film. I really recommend it. If you get a chance to see it, please see it.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have for questions. Maybe just on the final note, how can people support Lau San's work? Yeah, or Lau San socials, etc.
So we're having a week-long digital conference with two friends of ours, New Narrative based in Singapore and Malaysia, and also New Bloom based in Taiwan. And this is basically gonna be 4 days of us talking about our respective contexts of emergence and the sort of movements that we deal with, and the challenges a media initiative faces in terms of working with different movements and across the world and stuff. And so the signups are on Eventbrite if someone can post it, and you can still sign up for the sessions. I think they're not sold out yet. So the first day is about sort of New Narrative, New Bloom, and Lausan, all of our sort of like all of our projects. I think the third day or the second day is about the labor struggles in our respective sites and projects. And then finally, the third session is about our relationship with empire and sort of the problems of post-colonial solidarity and how to navigate that as a media movement. So those things are happening very soon, I think like in 2 days. So let me just post the link in the chat for everybody. And yeah, so that's one way that we can continue the conversation we're having here today. And other things, definitely would love to hear from any of you. If you have other questions or follow-up comments about anything we said today, you can contact us on lausan.hk/contacts. We sort of also have information about how to collaborate with us and how to work with us on different things like translation, or if you want to pitch an article to us, like that's also available. So yeah, definitely keep in touch if you want to. And also, yeah, just follow us on Instagram for Cherry's really amazing graphics, if nothing else.
Thank you. And with Softwall Stats, the next meeting the next talk for Forwarding Horizons is a conversation with migrant rights activists from Singapore and Hong Kong about supporting and working adjacently to migrant workers themselves. And that would happen in November, following which there's Monzoom School on the 31st of October with Pure Ever. And you can check this out at Softwall Stats website or our socials on Facebook or Instagram. So I'd like to thank everyone for your participation in this meeting, SR, JN, and Cherry for the amazing answers. I'd like to thank my co-facilitator, Godwin, the awesome tech crew from Softwall Stats, Sean, Johan, as well as our interpreters, HY, CLS, and Roxy for their help in making this meeting more accessible. Yeah, and thank you for all your questions and your participations, and we will see you in our next session. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark.
Everyone.
Thank you.